Alright, welcome to another how-to video for the CTX700. This time we're going to talk about removing and inspecting both sets of the brakes, the front and the rear brakes, on a Honda CTX700N. Now you're probably wondering why I'm making a video to tell you how to change brake pads. There's probably a million videos out there already. That is true. I'm sure if I looked on YouTube I could find 1,000,001 videos on how to change out brake pads on a car, truck, motorcycle, ATV, whatever. However, I am going to list out the torque specs for the bolts that are within these bikes. So if you don't have the service manual, I'll get you those torque specs. The parts that you're going to need are a 8mm socket, a 12mm socket, and a 14mm socket if you want to disassemble everything. Some rubber gloves, a flathead of Phillips, some silicone grease, torque wrench, some brake clean, and some Loctite if you don't want to replace the two bolts that I talked about a little bit later in the video. Alright, we're going to start on the front brake, and there's actually two ways to change out the brake pads on this. And I will note that I do not have the ABS on my motorcycle, so I can't tell you if it shouldn't be any different to change out brake pads. The ABS, you may have an extra little wheel in the middle with a sensor. But the brake itself should be fairly similar, but looking at the service manual, I didn't see a difference. But the service manual actually says for the front brake, you don't need to remove the actual caliper from the wheel, from the fork. You simply just take your 8mm socket and remove that lower bolt, that guy right down there. So that's the way I'm going to do to start. But that's for a quick change out. If you want to actually take things apart and clean them and get the brake dust off, so I'm going to show you the way that Honda tells you to do it, at least off of their service manual, and then I'm going to go a little step further just in case you want to do that. So as you can see from that, I was able to get the two brake pads out. The brake is obviously still on there. You remove that bolt and then you can work those brake pads down. Now it is quite a bit of a pain in the butt to actually get out, especially if your piston was recently compressed on the brake. You have to wiggle it and work with it, and trying to get them back in there, you could probably get them back in there fairly easy. But if you have new brake pads, these ones aren't in too bad of a shape. I mean, they got plenty of life left on them. Again, these only have about 8,000 miles on them. I'm just doing some inspections. You're going to have to compress that cylinder a little bit, but the brake actually slides back and forth to allow for you to maneuver and push things in. We're going to go ahead and take it a step further, and we're going to take these two bolts out now and disassemble it further. Now I have the whole brake assembly in my hand. If we were to take that other pin out now, we'd have very clean, easy access to move those brakes, as well as replace them just like this. We have access to the cylinders, the pistons, and then there's also this nice piece that actually slides, and we're gonna take it apart. All right, there we go, I've got it separated. It separates with one cylinder on there. They are greased. But I'm going to separate it just so I can clean out the brake dust off of this whole area and just shine them up, hopefully a little bit better than this. Alright, I've cleaned it. I used a little bit of some CRC Brake Clean. Anything CRC makes is usually actually pretty darn good stuff. You can see it's now nice and clean. I think its brass pieces are now nice and shiny, same with that. Same on the little caliper bracket, it's now nice and cleaned up. According to the manual, just use some silicone grease on this bolt right here, as well as the one that's at the top right there. So I'm just going to put a little bit of silicone grease on there, and then I'm going to start putting it back together. When you replace your brake pads, you got to clean these up as well. when you replace your brake pads, make sure you put some silicone grease on both ends just to allow them to slide a little bit better when they're in there. You should do that for your car, motorcycle, any type of vehicle that has disc brakes like that. So I got that bolt through there. I'm just going to tighten it down just a little bit. When you go to tighten this bolt down, this 8mm bolt, just remember that it needs to be tightened down to 13 foot-pounds. So right now I've put it back. I'm going to just separate the brake pads, and if one end's sticking together, you just use a small little flat head. You can kind of help separate them just a little bit. Don't push on the actual pad itself, but you can push in the little arm, and that usually will set it back. So now that we have the new pads in, just gently work it back over the rotor. Now that's back on the rotor. Alright, I've slid the two 12mm socket head bolts back in. The service manual actually says to replace those with new ones. I think it's because of that Loctite that's on there. What I did is I took a little wire brush and I scraped it away, and then I put in new. The service manual calls out 22 foot-pounds of torque for these bolts, as well as 13 for that bolt. Another little downfall I just had is my 3/8 socket wrench, my 3/8 Torx wrench, is no longer in a working capacity. So I'm going to have to just torque these and kind of guess at it for right now. Alright, so those are all torqued. If you move the pistons back, not a big deal, to fit the new brake pads in there. What you're going to want to slowly do, or what you're going to want to do, is squeeze the brake lever, let it fully extend out, and then give it another squeeze, and just slowly work that lever back down. As long as you didn't take the brake line off, you're not going to really have to, you shouldn't have to bleed it, because no new air would have gotten in the system. Now I know somebody on here is going to freak out that I was letting it dangle off the brake line. If you're that concerned about it, I wasn't. I don't think it's that heavy. I wasn't too concerned of it slipping off the hose or causing any damage to this brake line. It's not dry rotting. But if you are concerned, you can zip tie the whole caliper up to the fork while you're working on it. But again, I wasn't too concerned. Just use your best judgment for that. However, if you do need to bleed it out, your bleed's there for your front brake. If you want to completely remove it, drain out the, bleed the brakes completely dry, remove this bolt. This bolt has a 25-pound torque if you remove it. Alright, do the rear brake. You need to remove the saddlebag if you have one, so I'm going to go ahead and remove the right side saddlebag to get access to that brake. Alright, with that saddlebag removed, it's going to look awfully familiar. You got two 12mm bolts here, and then you have your one for the brake pad. Now for the rear brake, they actually tell you to remove this bolt as well and kind of tilt it up. I don't know why they specify in the service manual remove this bolt on the back one and not in the front, but I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing. I'm going to remove both bolts and just give it a thorough cleaning while I'm at it, as well as remove the single bolt. Alright, I found out why they don't want you to remove that back bolt. Because there's actually no rear clip for the brake pads. It actually is part of this assembly here. So if you leave that back one in, that's where it's gonna, if you leave that back bolt in, that's where it's actually gonna lock into. For cleaning purposes, you do need to remove both. But if you're just changing out your brake pads and not doing any maintenance back here, go ahead and leave that bolt that's closer to the front of the bike in. I will also add the bolt that's in the front is actually a unique kind of bolt. It's a shoulder bolt with the shoulders up in the front of the bolt, kind of rounded off. Is also a 14mm socket. It is not a 12mm. No, there we go. Now we'll focus on it. It's not a 12mm, so you will need a 14mm for this one bolt. Kind of maybe an idiot way of saying, hey, don't take me out. But I guess I'm a better idiot than Honda thought I was. All Alright, I've put those brake pads back in. I actually really like this design of the brake caliper. The whole unit actually slides. These bolts don't keep it fixed in place. It slides and self-centers onto the rotor, which is really, really interesting. Anyways, I've put the brakes back together. Same torquing specs for these bolts back here. Again, if you remove the pads or you push the cylinder, you're going to need to prime them just a little bit. So step on that front little pedal once or twice. Give it a few seconds in between presses to let the pressure build back up. And then once you feel it firm up, you know you're done. I'm going to go ahead and start the bike since I got the center stand on. And I use that pretty much all the time now. I'm going to go ahead and start the bike. I'm going to test the brake real quick because it's kind of an important thing.